Hello, bed crimers. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Today, I'm going to do part 2 of my indicators of Wendi Adelson's potential involvement in the unaliving of her ex-husband, Dan Markel, on July 18th into 19th of 2014. But before I get into that, please do me a favor, like, share, and subscribe. And if you want to support the work I do, please consider a membership or perhaps a PayPal donation, because PayPal allows me to keep the money, whereas YouTube takes a huge part of it. And now with that out of the way, let's get started. Note that when I talk about the Adelson family as a whole, I'm talking about Harvey, the father, Donna, the mother, Charlie, the brother, and Wendi. I'm excluding Rob, the eldest brother and the eldest son, because he is estranged from the family and he's a very upstanding man who was not involved in the crime. Now, you may recall that Wendi and Dan were involved in an acrimonious divorce, and Wendi wanted more than anything to move from Tallahassee, Florida, back to the Miami area to be closer to her parents and her brother, Charlie. The distance between Tallahassee and Miami is significant. We're talking a 7-hour and 30-minute drive by car, so it is not an easy commute. To move to Miami with her and Dan's 2 sons, Wendi needed permission from Dan Markel, and that was not likely to happen because of his position as a law professor at Tallahassee's Florida State University, or FSU as it is known. This is believed to be one of the main reasons Wendi's brother Charlie hired 2 thugs to unalive Dan. Keep in mind that Wendi Adelson has not been charged with any crimes at this time, so she is presumed innocent of any wrongdoing. Now, back in 2014, Wendi was also facing the possibility of losing her law license, and that's because of Dan's accusations that she'd hidden marital assets during their divorce. That is a no-no, and it's especially a no-no for a lawyer. So for Wendi Adelson, Dan Markel was posing major problems and obstacles, both for her move to Miami with their sons and for her ongoing career in the law. We're going to jump back into indicators of Wendi's potential involvement that took place on the day of the crime, July 18th of 2014. During her police interview on that day, Wendi never acted like a genuine victim, as in the distraught ex-wife of a man who's just received fatal injuries to his head and brain, a man who was the father to her 2 young sons. I venture to say we didn't see a lot of actual tears from her. Yes, she grabbed a Kleenex. Yes, she made crying sounds. Yes, her eyes looked red and puffy, but this appeared to be mostly acting, although there may have been some salty droplets. She put her hands over her face at times, likely to feign crying, in my opinion. And Wendi would have been well aware that police interrogation rooms have cameras and that she was being filmed. But were the scant tears she may have actually shed have been sobs of joy, because now, with Dan Markel suffering injuries that he would not recover from, she could get out of Tallahassee with her sons and live in Miami. And Dan's death also meant a stop to the legal battle that he was waging against her. Granted, Dan Markel was not yet dead, but his head injuries were clearly going to end his life. This likely would have given Wendi a huge sense of relief. Her problems were solved, provided she could keep herself off the list of suspects and out of jail. And it would seem that Wendi knew that as soon as Dan had his memorial service, she was going to move straight to Miami. Dan was injured on Friday, died on Saturday, had a memorial for him on Sunday, and Wendi moved to Miami on Monday, never to return to Tallahassee. She also lied to Dan's parents about them being able to see their grandsons. The parents, Ruth and Phil Markel, found out from Wendi that they would be unable to see the boys as promised because the boys were then in Miami. Wendi said it was because she feared for their lives and hers, but it was a very cruel thing to pull on Dan's grieving parents. Those little boys were their only tie to their deceased son. This is yet another indicator of Wendi's very cold heart. Now, prior to Dan's death, Wendi had spent 2 weeks in the Miami area visiting her parents and Charlie. Some people believe that some of this time was likely used rehearsing for the crime, allegedly. Perhaps Wendi was coached by her mother, Donna, and her brother, Charlie, on how to act during her police interview. Everyone knows that the victim's ex-spouse or partner is always at the top of the suspect list. So Wendi would have known that she was going to be called down to the police station for an interview. Now, while she was in the police cruiser on her way down to the station, you may recall that she was picked up while she was having lunch with some friends. She asked the officer if she was a suspect. This was before the police had told her that a crime had been committed and that Dan Markel had been injured. At that point, Wendi should have had no clue that anyone would be a suspect in any crime. So why is she asking if she's a suspect? That question would seem to indicate that she knew that Dan had been attacked. And during the interview, after she found out Dan was injured, Wendi kept asking, who would have done this? She also shared names of other people who might have a reason for wanting Dan Markel dead. For example, Wendi dropped Charlie's name and shared his twisted joke about looking into a hitman as a divorce present, but instead buying her a television. She also mentioned the ex-husband of Dan's then-girlfriend, Amy Adler. And she said maybe Amy's ex is angry because she's dating Dan. And then a friend of Wendi's who'd come down to the station at Wendi's request brought up Wendi's ex-boyfriend, Jeff Lacasse. Note that Wendi had just been talking to this friend about Lacasse and how jealous he was and how much he didn't like the way Dan Markel treated her. So it could be that Wendi had filled this friend's head with these stories about Lacasse in the hopes that the friend would throw Jeff Lacasse under the bus in the interview room as someone the police should look into. Another indicator of Wendi's possible involvement is her having a Geek Squad worker come to her house on the morning of the crime to supposedly try and fix the TV that Charlie had purchased for her. Why was it necessary to have a TV repairman come out to look at a cracked screen when Wendi could have simply called and asked if such a thing could be fixed? It sort of seems as though this visit from the Geek Squad may have been part of Wendi's alibi on the day Dan was injured. To have a solid alibi, you need to be able to prove it. Being able to have a member of the Geek Squad say that, yes, I was at Wendi's home that morning, and Wendi was home, meant that she could back up that part of her alibi. By the way, some people believe that the Adelsons used the word TV as code for red rum. Wendi repeated Charlie's hitman joke multiple times before the crime. According to Jeff Lacasse, she told him about Charlie's sick joke at least 2 times during their relationship. And mere days before Dan was attacked, Wendi confided in Jeff that Charlie really had looked into all possibilities, including hiring a hitman. She said this to Jeff on a Sunday, and by the following Friday, Dan was injured. Jeff said that Wendi had even mentioned the cost of the hitman. Jeff wasn't sure if he heard $15,000 or $50,000, but he did hear an amount. This is incredibly chilling given that Wendi said this on the week of the crime. And remember, Wendi also told the Geek Squad TV repairman this same joke. It's a very dark thing to mention on the same day that your ex-husband is going to be unalived. Here's another indicator of Wendi's potential knowledge of the crime before it happened. During her interview with the police, she failed to mention her young sons until 20 minutes into the conversation. You'd think that after hearing about the attack on Dan, and knowing that he was the one who had the boys in his care that day, Wendi would have been frantic to find out if her kids were okay. By not asking until 20 minutes into the conversation, it makes it seem like she already knew that her kids were fine and unharmed. Even if the detective mentioned that this was not about her kids when he collected her from the restaurant, you'd think that Wendi would want to know if the boys witnessed the attack, where Dan was attacked, were there any witnesses, what time did this happen? Instead of asking those questions, Wendi goes straight into who would have done this. At some point, Wendi learns that Dan is still alive. She doesn't react to that information with joy or with the desire to go and see him. Even though Wendi was divorced from Dan, you'd think she would still have some compassion for the father of her sons. Instead, it looks like her whole focus was to portray herself as innocent. Also, during the interrogation, Wendi seemed to be trying out the "let's frame Jeff Lacasse" strategy. She says to the victim advocate in the room at one point, "It sounds crazy when I talk about Jeff like this." But the victim advocate replies, "I don't think so." If we analyze this, it appears that Wendi is looking for feedback to see if the cops will actually give any weight to Jeff Lacasse being a potential suspect. Wendi also suggests to the detective that someone else might have done this to Dan on her behalf to help her. But think about that. Why would anyone think that someone would do this to Dan without first getting approval from Wendi? And what did Wendi tell other people that would make them so angry that they'd want to hurt Dan Markel, basically destroy him? And if someone did do this to Dan, don't you think Wendi would have been engaged in the plan? Wendi did not end her 5-hour interview at any point, and that's likely because she needed to get her story out there to the police. And over the 5 hours, she showed very little concern about Dan. She mentioned some concern for her sons, but not really that much considering what had just happened. Now, Dan died 5 to 6 hours after Wendi's interview ended. Despite him clinging on to life for those hours, Wendi never bothered to go to his bedside. Again, this was a man with whom she'd had her 2 children, so that seems very cold. During the interview, Wendi began fake crying immediately before knowing what Dan's fate would ultimately be. Again, all of these details, when puzzled together, start to create a very bad look for Wendi Adelson in terms of her not knowing about the crime ahead of time. Wendi did tell the detective that whoever did this to Dan should be punished to the full extent of the law, unless it's a family member. Dan and Wendi's friend, Tamara Demko, said that she didn't think any of the Adelsons would actually pull the trigger themselves, but that they'd be smart in putting a plan together where somebody else does the dirty work for them and where there are few ties, if any, to Wendi. Demko also said that Wendi is very good at keeping things close to the chest. Now let's talk about some indicators of Wendi's potential involvement in the crime that took place after Dan died. So the minute Dan died, Wendi by default got sole custody of their sons. For her, this solved her problem of wanting to move to Miami with her kids. She would no longer be stuck in Tallahassee because of Dan's job. And note that Dan was injured on Friday, died on Saturday, and by Monday, Wendi had already moved with the boys to Miami. Also, it looks like Wendi was the one Adelson that the family tried to protect to the utmost degree from any possible accusations. The other Adelsons, aside from Rob, shielded and protected Wendi. And I think when Charlie Adelson told his mother Donna on a phone call after Dan's death that Wendi doesn't know how lucky and fortunate she is, he may have been alluding to the fact that they all tried to keep her name out of their conversations and planning, allegedly. It's as if the family knew that there could be no ties to Wendi because the police would have been considering her the number one suspect from day one. Next, Wendi is the person who benefited the most from Dan's death. Dan was targeted for unaliving, not for robbery, not for burglary. Unaliving was the objective, and that means this crime was extremely personal, and it was also the ultimate form of revenge for perhaps not allowing Wendi to move to Miami with the boys, and also for accusing Wendi of hiding those marital assets. The minute Dan died, everything fell into place for Wendi. She was able to move to Miami, she had her boys, she didn't have any fears about losing her law license. Now, Tamara Demko told the police that Wendi put Dan through hell for the past year and a half, and that Wendi is the person who had so many reasons for wanting Dan to go away permanently. And Wendi's parents also had reasons for wanting Dan gone, and that's because he asked the court to ensure that Donna's visits with his sons were supervised. You may recall that the boys had reported back to their father, Dan Markel, that their grandmother, Donna, had been saying that he was stupid and also that he wanted to take them away, take her sunshines away from her, Donna referring to the boys as her sunshines. Demko also thought it was strange that Wendi never called her to tell her about Dan's death. Why would Wendi avoid calling Demko to share the news? Could it be that her guilty conscience made it so that she didn't want to talk to anyone close to Dan unless she had to? A phone call like that would have forced Wendi once again into acting mode if she was indeed involved. When Demko went to Wendi's house after Dan's memorial service on Sunday, she noticed that Wendi seemed fairly calm when opening the door. She also noticed that Wendi was continually surrounded by her friends. So it was basically impossible for Demko and even for the Markels to approach Wendi. And Ruth Markel really wanted to speak with Wendi to see how she was doing and to ask about the boys. But Wendi kept her cut off physically as well. Per Tamara and Ruth, Donna Adelson seemed to be acting appropriately for the situation. She was in hostess mode, but Wendi's father, Harvey, could not look Demko in the eye, and that seemed really odd to Demko. Did Harvey maybe also have a guilty conscience? Wendi told Ruth when she suddenly moved to Miami on Monday, which prevented Ruth from seeing her grandsons, that she was worried for her safety and that of the boys. However, if Wendi and her family were so worried, why didn't they have private security at Wendi's house? The family is wealthy and they could have afforded this. Also, why would they gather at Wendi's house if they were really concerned that the perpetrator might try to harm her and her boys? It really doesn't make sense, and it seems like the Adelsons weren't legitimately worried, and that was likely due to Charlie being the one who hired the hitmen Sigfredo Garcia and Luis Rivera. The next indicator is Wendi's immediate move to Miami. This meant that she was not easily accessible by the Tallahassee police. And you have to wonder how her and Dan's sons handled this sudden move. It doesn't show a lot of care for how the boys felt. I'm sure they loved their father and would not have wanted to suddenly leave their lives in Tallahassee, their schools, their friends. Of course, they were only 3 and 4 years old at the time, but still. Also, Wendi's parents and her brother Charlie wouldn't speak to the police. They didn't seem interested in helping the cops get justice for Dan and in helping the police figure out who done it. The next indicator is that according to Jeff Lacasse, Wendi's boyfriend and then ex-boyfriend, she got a different phone after Dan's death because she thought that her phone might have been bugged by the police. If you know you're innocent of any involvement, why would you worry about the police bugging your phone? Another indicator is that Wendi, like her parents and Charlie, showed an extreme disinterest in seeing the case solved. Wendi also denied Dan's parents, Ruth and Phil Markel, access to Dan's children for a period of 6 years. For the Markels, those little boys were their only tangible link to Dan. For Wendi to deny Dan's grieving parents this shows an extreme degree of cruelty, both to the boys and to the Markels. This would appear to show that Wendi had no problem wiping out the Markels from her sons' lives. A parent who truly cares about her children and their emotional well-being would have wanted to maintain a connection to the father's family. And the Markels had so much love to offer to the boys. And still, Wendi denied her sons that love and that connection to their father. Also, about a year after Dan's death, Wendi changed her son's last name from Markel to Adelson. That was another gesture designed to wipe the Markels off the family tree. Why would she want to deny her sons their father's last name? Imagine what those two boys must think now that their Uncle Charlie has been convicted of their father's unaliving and their grandmother is in jail facing similar charges. Would it be a leap for those boys to now wonder if their mother, Wendi, was also involved, especially when she did things like change their last names? Right after Dan died, Wendi began looking into ways to get money from Dan's FSU death benefits, money from a GoFundMe that Tamara Demko had set up, and from Dan's life insurance. Wendi claimed that she was Dan's widow and thus had a right to all that money. Now that could speak to yet another motive for her wanting Dan dead, the financial benefit, allegedly. Next, let's talk about Wendi's behavior while she was testifying in the earlier trials of Sigfredo Garcia and Catherine McBanoa. Wendi actually smiled when saying that she was not going to be arrested. This just makes it seem like she's positive that her family members are going to take the fall for her. Also, there's nothing funny or worthy of smiling about when you're talking about Dan Markel's death. Wendi also claimed that she couldn't remember how much money she took from her and Dan's shared bank account when she filed for divorce. Are you kidding me? You don't remember how much money you took? That, in my opinion, shows that she's willing to lie under oath on the stand, allegedly. Also, during those initial trials, Wendi appeared to have no real interest in getting Sigfredo Garcia and Catherine Magbanua convicted. Luis Rivero actually took a plea deal, so he never went to his own trial. He didn't have a trial. Wendi laughed during her testimony at certain questions and made some snarky replies. She also blinked her eyes a lot, which could be a rehearsed move to try and look doe-eyed and innocent. And she often did this when she was looking at the jurors. Also, she never glared at the hitman, Sigfredo Garcia, or at Catherine Magbanua. If you're a victim of this crime, you're not going to be calm around one of the hitmen and other defendants. It's almost like Wendi didn't want to implicate Catherine Magbanua for her role in Dan's death. Here's another indicator. How did the hitmen know that they needed to unalive Dan on that Friday before he went out of town? Dan actually had plans to go to New York that weekend. So who would have been the best source for that information? It would have had to have been Wendi. In the first trial, where Sigfredo Garcia and Catherine Magbanua were tried together, and when Wendi was under oath, she denied driving to the crime scene or even being on Trescott Drive on the day of the crime. Trescott Drive is where Dan's house was, and it's where the crime took place. Wendi only admitted to seeing some activity down the road, but she said she thought it was a downed tree. But at Katie Magbanua's second trial, the trial she needed to have because her first trial ended in a mistrial, Wendi admitted that she was blocked by police cars and had to turn around. This proves that Wendi was only a few houses away from Dan's house, because we know where those squad cars were parked. And so it proves that she saw police activity there. She saw Dan's driveway, and she likely saw the crime scene tape. So why did she have zero concern for her sons and for Dan at that point? Remember, Dan had custody that day. Many people believe the reason Wendi drove to Trescott Drive was to see for herself that the crime had been carried out. She may have wanted confirmation that the hit was done. Wendi's two different answers as to what she saw when near and or on Trescott Drive is very damning evidence. Wendi said she went that way to take a shortcut, but apparently Trescott Drive has a lot of speed bumps. So it wasn't really the best shortcut to the liquor store that she said she was driving to. Sadly for Wendi, it looks like she couldn't control her curiosity, and she couldn't wait until someone else called her to let her know that the crime had gone down, allegedly. This is me speculating about why Wendi would have been near the crime scene that day, just about an hour after the crime went down. Now, Wendi did a podcast in which she claimed she was interrogated for 8 hours. First of all, it wasn't really an interrogation. It was more like an interview. Second, it lasted for 5 hours, not 8. While both are long interviews, I think the exaggerated 8 hours is once again designed to make Wendi look like a victim. Wendi also denied Ruth and Phil Markel and Dan's sister email access and text messaging to her sons. She also made sure that Ruth Markel was never alone with her and Dan's boys. Why? Was she afraid that Ruth might say something to the boys to implicate her? Why did Wendi feel the need for so much control over her sons and their grandparents on their father's side? Another cruel act that Wendi did was eliminating one of her son's middle names, a name that was connected to Dan Markel's grandmother. And Wendi never checked with the Markels to see if they were okay with that name change and also with the last name change from Markel to Adelson. That had to be incredibly painful for Ruth and Phil, and probably confusing to the boys. Now, Wendi's brother, Charlie Adelson, said that Dan's death basically turned Wendi into a trust fund baby who never earned the money. Charlie said that on one of his phone calls with Donna Adelson. From Social Security, Wendi received $2,400 a month for each of her sons until they turned 18. And it turns out that her total financial gain from Dan's death was more than $2 million, according to former defense attorney Carl Steinbeck. And we all know that money is a classic motive for red rum. So for 2 years after Dan Markel's death, no suspects were arrested and charged. And this period for the Adelsons was likely very enjoyable because they probably felt that the crime had gone down beautifully and that its results were exactly what they wanted, allegedly. And that would have been true until the two hitmen, Sigfredo Garcia and Luis Rivera, were identified and arrested. When that happened, everything changed. That meant that the police were just that much closer to discovering what Charlie Adelson had done. Now, Wendi Adelson actually wore the same outfit for the first two trials. That would be Sigfredo Garcia and Catherine McBanawa's trial together, and then Catherine McBanawa's second trial because of the mistrial. Wendi wore the exact same dress for the two trials. Why? Did she want to emphasize that she was going to say the exact same things in the second trial? Did she want to appear as a frugal woman who wasn't into buying different clothing items? It seems like a very calculated move. And by the way, Wendi has never taken her sons to visit their grandparents, Ruth and Phil Markel, in Canada. And so the boys have never been to their father's grave in Canada. Pure cruelty. Also, when Ruth and Phil mailed gifts to the boys from 2016 until 2021, Wendi offered no consistent acknowledgement of the gifts. Wendi also would not reply to Ruth's emails asking about how the boys were. Why hurt the grandparents when they're trying to maintain a relationship with their deceased son's boys? Wendi actually disinvited the Markels to her son Benjamin's bar mitzvah after learning that the two hitmen had been arrested. And why hurt the Markels because of that? Afraid to interact with them? Now, according to Carl Steinbeck, Wendi pretty much cut the Markels off from the boys, except for when it came time for her to testify in the various trials. She would allow contact right before she had to testify on the stand. So it seems like she wanted to be able to say that the Markels have been allowed access to Dan's children. Then after giving testimony in a trial, Wendi would once again cut off the communication. Now, when Wendi was in court and she was asked to name her father Harvey's business, she replied, Dr. Harvey Adelson, DDS, not the correct name, which was the Adelson Institute. And she closed her eyes a long time as if to think about it. In my opinion, this points to Wendi being evasive instead of completely forthright and honest. And when she was asked if her mother despised Dan, Wendi said, no, Donna didn't despise him. She just didn't like the way he treated her. It's patently untrue. We've seen Donna's emails, and the horrible things she said about Dan Markel. We saw the ways she was plotting to alienate him so that he might just break down and allow Wendi to move to Miami with his sons. Wendi also said that her parents never said anything negative about Dan, and we know that Donna called Dan stupid in front of the boys. Also, when she was asked if her mother Donna is controlling, Wendi would not admit it. We know about all the things that Donna suggested to Wendi to try and ruffle Dan's feathers, like converting his sons to Catholicism or dressing them up in Nazi uniforms. Donna Adelson is the epitome of a controlling mother, and yet Wendi won't admit it. This again points to Wendi's willingness to be deceptive. Some people believe that Donna was the mastermind behind the crime. However, if we look at all these indicators of Wendi's possible guilt, it begins to look like maybe Wendi could be the actual mastermind and Donna a collaborator, allegedly. Again, Wendi had the most to gain from Dan's death. So that wraps up the indicators of Wendi Adelson's potential guilt in the unaliving of her ex-husband, Dan Markel. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I will see you next time on Bed Crime Stories. Like, share, subscribe. See ya!